Game 6 of the World Chess Championship final between Magnus Carlsen, the world champion, and his challenger Jan Nepomniachtchi. Well, so far we've had 5 draws. Could they actually get a decisive game in Game 6? Well, this was an extraordinary game. Both players came to this encounter with so much energy. In fact, well, this game had it all. It was like a play over 9 acts or something. In fact, this game broke the record for the longest game in World Chess Championship history. Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces. Now let's see what he came out with. So it's d4, knight f6, knight f3, d5. And instead of c4 that we saw in game 2, so g3. Now this is already an unusual move, not a main line, and certainly not a forcing move in any way. And I think already this is an indication that Magnus Carlsen is just saying, I'm not interested in prepared lines. Let's just play chess. Let's just get a position on the board. So e6, Nepo just playing very orthodox way, very steadily. So it's basically what we have on the board is a Catalan. Catalan is where white fianchettos this bishop, but hasn't played c4. c4 would transpose to normal lines. That's what we had in game 2. But Carlsen just played b3, just preparing to put his bishop on b2 or just supporting this pawn advance. This is already very, very unusual. You know, if white isn't claiming or the centre or putting pressure on the centre, then black should be okay. But as I said, it's a change in strategy for Carlsen. He just wants to get a position on the board, doesn't want to get involved in prepared lines. Nepo reacted in a very principled way, attacking the centre with a pawn. So if white isn't going to claim the centre, then black should do that. Carlsen exchanged pawns, and then he attacked in the centre with pawn to c4. Pawn takes pawn from Nepo. Now, well, if white recaptures, then that's just an isolated pawn on its own, not very good. So Carlsen played queen c2. Now, this was obviously a prepared line, but it's pretty mild stuff. And, well, Nepo thought for a little bit, played queen here. I mean, obviously that can't be taken because of queen takes bishop. But queen e7 is very sensible, getting the queen out of this line. So just tucked away very nicely. And defending the bishop. Carlsen sacked pawn. Knight d2. So he'd obviously prepared this. And certainly if this pawn is taken, then white has very nice open diagonals for the bishops. But Nepo thought for 13 minutes and played knight c6. Very sensible, just bringing out a piece. And in fact, Nepo played very boldly now. There's a big problem with black's position in these kind of Catalan positions. That is where white has this bishop on the long diagonal. This bishop doesn't get into play very easily. But if black can solve that problem, then black should be fine. And Nepo did that with this excellent move, pawn to b5. And after knight e5, here's the point. Well, if knight takes knight, that's disastrous, because then the bishop rules on this diagonal. But instead, Nepo played knight b4, attacking the queen. The queen has to move, and then bishop b7. So with this move, as I said, basically this bishop is the problem. If you can develop that piece and neutralize this bishop on g2, then black shouldn't have any problems at all. So basically Nepo invested the time and has equalized the position. And here, well, frankly, I was anticipating that Carlsen might just exchange pieces, and there's not a lot going on in that position. I thought, oh, we're heading for the early draw. But no, that was not the case. Carlsen decided he wants to keep pieces on the board. So he declined an exchange, dropped the knight back, hitting the bishop. And then he put the bishop on g5. Rook fd8 played. I mean, black seems absolutely fine here. These bishops look quite attractive. Carlsen took here. And, well, we've already seen that Carlsen has avoided exchanging by putting that knight back here. And here, well, Nepo had a very safe continuation. He could have gone into an endgame like this. And I think black is pretty comfortable there. I mean, it's about even. But instead, he decided that he wanted to play for more. He kept the queens on the board. He's got the 2 bishops. Why not? So this is ambitious from both players. Rook c1. Okay, looks sensible to bring a rook to the middle. Knight d4. Now it exchanges pieces, but basically what it does is, put this bishop on an excellent central square, and the queen not on a great square here. It has to protect that pawn. Nepo exchanged bishops and took control over the long diagonal with a check. Good move. And then centralised the queen. Well, this is great classical chess. Queens love being in the centre of the board. They radiate power across the board. Just compare the position of these 2 pieces. Nepo's queen obviously much better than Carlsen's in the corner. So that's why Carlsen played queen c2. But black's pieces look pretty impressive here. Rook d1, king g7, just gently moving up the board, that's okay. And here rook d2 from Carlsen. So his idea with this is that, I mean, he's actually, this looks very mild, but actually he's looking to play actively as well. What he wants to do is drop the queen back, push the pawn to e3, and then perhaps move the knight here and maybe bring the queen across to the king side. But, well, I mean, Nepo has various responses to this, but he's sought to unbalance the position with rook here. Very interesting. So he's inviting Carlsen to give up his queen for 2 rooks. It's a rough material balance. But Nepo obviously thought that with his active queen and bishop, that he would have the better chances here. It certainly unbalances the position, and basically very hard to say who stands better here, but all 3 results are possible from this position. Queen d5. Well, this is Carlsen's problem, that Nepo can now look to attack those queenside pawns, and a4 looks to fix that pawn on a3. So it's a very unbalanced position, actually. It could swing either way. This next move from Carlsen was very clever indeed. h4 looks strange, but basically the idea is to give the king some extra room, but also, I mean, this sounds incredible, but that pawn can be used in an attack on the king. So watch this. Here Nepo blocks with h5, but watch what happens if the queen plunges in. White has a chance to attack the king. And actually that pawn, I mean, this is just a sample variation of what could occur. But basically that pawn on h5 comes into play and can actually work in White's favour. And it adds an extra attacking piece, and actually this should be winning for White. Okay, it's a very long variation, but I just wanted to show that actually that pawn on h4 does have a point. So that's why Nepo blocked it, but that's a very committal move. It's not a bad move objectively, but that pawn could be loose later on. King h2, just tucking the king out of the way. And at this moment, Carlsen was actually running very short of time, so he was taking enormous risks in playing for a win here. And bishop b2 starts to target this one. If rook takes, then queen takes. I mean, this is probably okay for Carlsen. He can defend this position. But what's interesting is that he was now playing for more. Even though he was running really short of time, he had about 3 minutes left at this point. Nepo had 13 minutes left. Queen d6. And here, well, basically, Nepo was trying to sort of rush Carlsen. And here Carlsen has a fantastic move. Carlsen was basically looking at this pawn. He could have played rook c2. I mean, you're never going to find this move when you're short of time. But here's the point. So bishop takes pawn. You basically give up your queenside pawns, but you turn in this direction and you turn towards the king. And after this, incredibly, white has a tremendous attack here. It is very difficult for black to defend this position. And the funny thing is, basically, you attack on the 8th rank. If the king steps up, then knight takes pawn. That's the point. Obviously, that can't be taken as a pin. And if bishop back, then actually this is a winning move. This is going to win. But, I mean, impossible for Carlsen to spot that. A very unusual attacking idea. Carlsen played rook d1. Yeah, I mean, I think if he'd had more time, he probably would have seen it, but not when he was just down to, a couple of minutes basically, and still had to get to move 40. This is move 33 they're on. So Carlsen had a lot of moves to make. And this is dangerous the way he's playing, because you can see those rooks are split. When rooks are split, they can't protect each other and they are vulnerable to the queen. And Carlsen had missed this move. This is an excellent move from Nepo. So that hits the rook. So for example, if the rook just moves here, then queen c7. Queens are fantastic at seeking out weaknesses. This would actually win material. You can see these pieces are just too loose, and black is going to win material. So Carlsen had to compromise. He brought the rook here, and now Nepo could just take that pawn. But he was playing for more. Really interesting. So he's taking that square away from the knight, and perhaps looking to play down here. Rook c2. I mean, this is very risky stuff. Nepo should take that pawn, and well, it'll get to a position like this basically. Let me just go on a few moves. This is difficult for white, but it should be tenable. White should hold that, but white has to make some good moves here. You know, it's like white has a fortress, but black is obviously for choice in that position. But instead, Nepo played queen d5. So, you know, coming up to the time control, Carlsen was playing quickly. Nepo was trying to rush him a bit. So these moves, certainly not accurate. And in fact, Carlsen missed a fantastic move here. This was move 40, and Carlsen went down to just 20 odd seconds he had left to make this final move before the time control. And, well, he played it safe. He took this pawn. If he'd spotted this move, the game might have been over. That protects the knight. Everything's protected. In fact, it's really hard for black to make any move here because that queen has to keep hold of these pieces. Basically, black is going to crack here. Let me just show you the basic idea is this, that, well, white prepares this. White takes this, and with this little tactic can win that. Now, it's still not over, but basically white should be able to rearrange the rooks to break through on one of these squares. It's complicated, folks, but yeah, that was a chance for Carlsen. Instead he took here. It's the obvious move. It's the move you're going to make when you have seconds on the clock. And Nepo made the final move as well, queen b3, and he was also running short of time. So what's going on? So after move 40, basically they get another hour, 20 moves in the next hour, and they've got to this position, which, well, this is difficult for black. Although this pawn looks pretty scary here. In fact, you know, there's pressure on this pawn. Remember, that was quite a risky move from Nepo earlier, and now, yeah, he's going to pay for this because that pawn is weak. But it's still tenable for black, basically. But watch what happens. Somehow Carlsen manages to create a few chances. So king g1, make sure that pawn is protected. Queen b3. Now this knight shuffles around here, so that knight is looking to come to c2 and then to take this pawn. But in the meantime, Nepo manages to find some counter chances on the other side of the board. So watch this. Queen e4. Carlsen takes that pawn with the rook. Basically, there isn't going to be time to do this. This pawn can be taken. So anyway, Carlsen takes here. So what's his idea? Well, basically, in this kind of position, White has pretty good chances here because it's going to be possible for White, for example, to bring that rook round here, maybe put it on f4, maybe rearrange that knight. This pawn is vulnerable. I mean, another way is to play the knight into f4 as well, and to play rook a5 to target that pawn. Basically, this is going to drop, and then it's not simple for the queen. So Nepo plays correctly. He takes that pawn with check. King g1, and well, here he played queen e4. It's like, well, I mean, maybe a better chance was queen g4 to try and get in h4. But queen e4, I mean, it's still very hard to see how Carlsen is going to make progress here, but he managed to. Knight e2 hits the queen. Rook a2. So everything is protected. This is the point. White has to maintain coordination. Those rooks have to connect with each other. Now, I was really surprised at Carlsen's next move. Once again, so this is move 58, and the players were running really short of time, particularly Carlsen. I was expecting him just to move the king, probably to h2, but he played f3. It's a very committal move because it opens the king on the second rank, potentially weakens this pawn. But let's see what happened. Queen d1, f4. So that was move 60. And that was the last move of the time control. So Carlsen, I have to say, I didn't particularly like the way Carlsen played this, advancing this pawn. It seemed to me that, this opened up the king. So again, they reach the time control. They get extra time. So they had 15 minutes added to their time. And they get, from this moment, from move 61, they get 30 seconds added each time they make a move. But still, they're having to play very quickly here. Carlsen still has to play basically like an oil tanker. As Spassky used to say, you have to just get a position that is impregnable. But it's not simple. So we've still got this rough material balance. And Nepo is now targeting that pawn on e3, which makes life a little bit difficult for White. Rook a1, queen b3, rook e4. So that protects this weak pawn, but now, just for a moment, the rooks are split. That's dangerous. This can still go badly wrong for Carlsen if he gets it, if he overlooks a tactic. When these rooks are split, they're not connected, they're loose. f5. There is an amazing idea here. This was pointed out by Suryasekar Ganguly in the commentary on Chess24. He's commentating with Judith Polgar, and I have to say they did a brilliant job today. Very interesting human stories from Surya about his time working with Anand. But he pointed out a brilliant variation. Watch this. So Nepo played here queen b4. He could have played queen d3. Rook g8 check. Now this looks very nasty for black. The rook protects the pawn. It looks like the rook is going to come here. The next rook comes here, and f5 could well drop. Among other things, the h5 pawn could drop as well. But watch this, a brilliant idea. h4, you give that pawn away. Then you give the bishop away. Then you give the queen away. And that is stalemate. Black has no legal move. You can see the king cannot move. because those files are controlled by the rook, that would be a draw. Incredible. Stalemate. One of my favourite rules in chess. Now, white did have ways to avoid that after queen d3. There are various ways to play on, but I just wanted to show that extraordinary defence. Queen b4 was played by Nepo instead. He's still okay here, actually. Rook c8. And now, counterplay. Queen e1 check, and the queen comes in. So Carlsen had to come back with the rook. So Nepo is maintaining his activity, maintaining pressure. Queen b3. Still pressure here. So Carlsen hasn't been able to make it pay with those rooks at the other end of the board. But he's still trying. Queen d5, rook c8. So it almost looks like they're repeating moves. Not quite though. Nepo played actively. Queen h1. I mean, it feels as though Carlsen isn't getting anywhere here. But he just shuffled again. Played rook b1. Obviously realised he had to keep the queen out of there for the moment. Rook b1 hits the bishop. Both players were going under 5 minutes at this moment. Remember, they don't get any more time added, apart from the 30 seconds per move. But very tough. Basically, they couldn't take any breaks from this moment on. Bishop c5, rook e5, queen d3, still pressure here. Magnus was now on a minute and a half, and after his next move, he was down to 27 seconds. This was really extraordinary. So, in order to try and get something from this position, he was taking incredible risks. And if you get it wrong with white, you can still lose this position. Let's see. Bishop b6. So Magnus repeated a couple of times to gain extra time. And finally, he managed to take one of those pawns. But it's still not simple, because Nepo has this counter-attack here. And if the rook comes back, then black can take, and then this rook is loose. But Carlsen had foreseen this, and he realised that he could simplify down to this endgame. So he gives up one of the rooks and takes the bishop. So now we have this unusual endgame of rook, knight and 2 pawns against a queen. Unusual material balance. Of course, there's a couple of extra pawns. Now, if you feed this into a chess engine, it says that this is a draw. It thinks it's pretty barren. But this is not at all easy for black, because that queen can't find a weakness in white's position. So basically Carlsen, with his pieces, can maneuver around, making sure everything is protected, and slowly try to advance his pawns, or perhaps even target that pawn on h5. Now, this is extremely difficult to play for white. Notice how Carlsen just makes sure everything is protected and rock solid before he contemplates advancing. So with this move, you can see what he's trying to do. He wants to launch that e-pawn down the board, but not so simple. So Nepo making it very difficult indeed. The players couldn't take a break because, you know, they were down to their final few minutes here, and you can see that it looks like they're just kind of going around in circles here. But it's extraordinary how Carlsen somehow manages to just improve his position a little bit. Still going around in circles. Yeah, I think we've seen this one roughly before. Now knight g1. Okay, interesting. He's got a plan. Watch what he does. Check. The king goes back. Rook d4. Aha. Okay, so notice he's still making sure everything is protected. And now he's getting ready to play pawn to e4. And then that is progress. And after the check, somehow he's worked his magic so that the knight protects the king, guards the rook, and e4 is now on the cards. So that's incredible. It's taken Carlsen, 30 odd moves to get there, but he somehow managed to arrange it. Now, the engines were still saying that black is fine here. But Carlsen has made definite progress. You just repeated the moves there. Now here, Nepo plays the pawn to h4. That's a controversial move. You could say it kind of simplifies the position in some ways. The h5 pawn could be a target. But it means that the knight no longer has to guard that pawn on g3 after this exchange. The machines still thought that this was absolutely fine for black. Black should draw this with best play. But somehow, I think in practical terms, I'm not sure about that pawn move h4. So in some ways the position has clarified for both players in a way, but I think particularly for Carlsen, it's quite clear what he has to do. He has to advance these pawns. And this reminds me of that formation used by Roman legions, the testudo or the tortoise, where the soldiers would place their shields over their head and at their sides, and they would march forward slowly without any weaknesses, shielding themselves from attack. And that's basically exactly what Carlsen has to do here. He has to make sure everything is together, everything is protected before he advances. So that queen is just buzzing around. It would love to be able to attack something, but no weaknesses at all. So Carlsen just remaining like that Roman legion. King f3, everything protected. And there we go. We're now at move 124. And with this move, 125, the players broke the record for the longest game in World Championship history. Korchnoi and Karpov, in their World Championship match in 1978, played 124 moves and agreed a draw. They played a match of 32 games. That was only game 5, that 124 move draw. They had extraordinary stamina. This match is only 14. But wow, this game was tough. Of course, we were now well into, over 7 hours the players had played. But this is now starting to be very difficult for black. Somehow Carlsen has managed to do it. He's advanced another step. That rook, everything is still protected. This is the key. And the king now finds cover by that knight. So here we go. And now the machine indicates, a few moves ago, the machine was indicating that black had 10 different moves that were still within the drawing zone. Now it's only 2 moves apparently that are in the drawing zone. And those moves are queen c2 or queen b1. Now why those moves are drawing, nobody knows. You certainly wouldn't be able to see that in a game. Nepo played what looks to be a decent move, pinning. But apparently this is now lost for black. You can see white's pieces advancing up the board. The king is completely safe. And this was a brilliant move from Carlsen. He was playing very, very quickly at this moment. Pawn to e6. This is fantastic. So if queen takes rook, then knight g7 wins the queen. And, well, there are some positions where that pawn might be taken, but there's going to be a knight fork there. Queen g6, let's see that. So here, rook f7. Carlsen had planned this, of course. Now, what's the secret of good technique? Good calculation. If queen takes pawn, knight check. Watch this sequence. Of course, Carlsen had calculated this out. And I'm sure you all know this is a winning king and pawn endgame because white wins the opposition. Let's just see that through to the finish. There you go. The king comes here and the pawn advances to the end. There we go. Good calculation from Carlsen. King d8 and Nepo can do absolutely nothing now. knight g7. And here, Nepomniachtchi resigned the game. The game lasted almost 8 hours. It finished at midnight in Dubai. Extraordinary. Let's just see exactly why Nepo resigned. Queen h2 check. Basically, you can check the king, but it's going to hide at the other end of the board, and there is nothing to stop those pawns going through now. Fantastic. There you go. The Roman legion testudo performed or executed perfectly by Carlsen. Wow, the players looked exhausted, but somehow, you know, when you win a game, you forget you're exhausted. Nepo looked absolutely shattered. Carlsen said, obviously I'm exhausted, but I'm elated. And he said, well, today, you know, he was asked, you know, what made the difference today? And he said, well, I was maybe a little more patient. I think that's true. Maybe a bit more patient than Nepo. And, well, Carlsen is famous for playing out these long games. He has such incredible physical and mental stamina, and that really showed in this game today. But he did say, I was running on fumes at the end, but you wouldn't have known it because he was playing really fluently at the end. I mean, this game had everything. 2 players going for the win. You had brilliant moves. You had mistakes. You had time pressure. And finally, the longest game in World Championship history, and finally a decisive result. Jan Nepomniachtchi was asked, how will you bounce back? And he said, hopefully in style, which I tell you what is an incredible answer when you've just lost the game like that. He was he's obviously shattered, but still held it together in the press conference. So let's have a look at the scores. Here we go. Magnus Carlsen wins game 6 and now leads in the match 3.5, 2.5. Remember, they play best of 14 games in total. They will be playing tomorrow. Let's look at the match schedule. So we have game 7 tomorrow on Saturday, 16:30 in Dubai. Well, how will Nepo cope with that? It's going to be tough. Do check out the coverage on Chess24, the Oslo studio, hosted by Kaya, excellent journalist, and she's ably supported by some English players, David Howell, Jovanka Huska and Simon Williams, are doing an excellent job of getting the story across. And I have to say, Judith Polgar, I thought, did a brilliant job today, supported by Suryaseka Ganguly, who gave some fantastic stories about his time working with Anand. They're also on Chess24. So here we go. Game 7 tomorrow. This match has exploded into life. Nepo has got to come out and try to hit back. But, well, he looked exhausted. Will he have enough stamina? We've got 2 games in a row, Saturday and Sunday. It's going to be grueling for both players. Join me for another recap tomorrow. Thanks very much for watching.